Certainly, the Russians never expected this to happen. At the same time, while this is a victory, it's not a decisive one. They've got to conduct more attacks, more effective attacks, and push the Russians back, and hope that the Russians don't change the way they fight. So we can't be sure. Certainly a major event, but I think it's a mistake to think of it as a groundbreaking one. The problem with nuclear weapons is the wind. If the wind blows from the west, it's going to be Russia. It's fried. He can't attack troops with those weapons because the Russian troops are nearby and they also get killed. So these are not very useful weapons. And it's the same with chemical weapons. You know, it can be used back at them. But finally, the Russians don't know what the Americans will do in the event they use nuclear weapons or chemical weapons. They might do something, who knows what. But the Russians don't know. And I think even if Putin wanted to do this, the Russian people around him will stop it.
The Russian fear that went into Ukraine is the fear of Europe. The Germans, the French all invaded Russia, and they were survived by distance, strategic depth. They were defeated by that. By the time they got to Moscow, it was winter. And what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union was that the border of Ukraine was 236 miles along Route 30 from Moscow. From the Russian point of view, this was a catastrophe waiting to happen. You would say, nobody's planning to invade Russia. And they'd say, Napoleon himself didn't know he was going to invade Russia. So, now if the Russians take all of Ukraine, they have moved their border to the border of NATO, because the border of Ukraine is the border of Poland and Slovakia, Poland of Hungary, and we will defend them because we will not allow the Russians to dominate the European peninsula. Russian power coupled with the European peninsula, well, that was the Cold War. In other words, if the Russians took all of Ukraine, we would be back in the Cold War. As grateful we are for Italian help always, we may have to do it ourselves. We do not want to stand, as we have a saying in America, you know, that we were standing at the German border. We don't want to stand at the Ukrainian border from Poland and from other places. So they cannot live with the frontier where it is. They cannot live with the enemy potential 236 miles from Moscow. We cannot live with an other European war like World War II or an episode like the Cold War. So they don't want an American ally where it is, and we don't want them where they're coming. And now we'll have a discussion. And the discussion is being held where the Russians discover something about the Americans. We're really very powerful. Simply the weapon of the dollar, the trade currency, we forced Russia out of the system, hurt them. But we were able to arm the Ukrainians with weapons that devastated the Russian army, and we have not lost any people. So, our people. So the situation is that each side has very reasonable fears of the other. And the question of how this all breaks out is first determined by the military outcome, the essential failure of the Russian invasion. It didn't work. So now there will be a negotiation. It would have been a much more powerful negotiation from the Russian point of view if they hadn't been defeated first. But we will have a negotiation. It will be settled. And we will spend the next 10 years wondering where the Europeans were. Because one of the great mysteries of America is European foreign policy. But we finally figured it out. Let the Americans do it, and then we'll criticize them. Oh, it's a good way. Well, this is a problem of all ceasefires. How do you secure it? When I spoke before about the Russians not wanting the Americans at their border, well, this is the problem that we face. But the military situation is such that it's clear that the Ukrainian-American alliance has the upper hand militarily. How much longer can the Russians fight? Part of the question is, from a purely military point of view, their ability to supply their troops that far west is stretched. The second issue, of course, is how long do their people tolerate this? We've had in history where the Russian people stood up during World War II and said, enough. So this is one of the questions on China too. The cost of the Russian adventure is outstripping the benefits, but it's very hard to find a way to get out. And that is really the difficulty. We can find every understanding, but we have to trust each other on terrain, on what is going to be trained. And the Russians don't trust us. We don't trust the Russians. And there really is no party with the weight to negotiate. The Europeans have been in a defensive posture. They've been helping the Americans. The Russians don't trust them at all. So who could come in and guarantee and have the ability to guarantee the borders? Well, we don't really trust the Chinese, but it might be an interesting conversation to have next week, because the Americans absolutely want this over. This is enough. We do not intend to spend 2 years fighting with the Ukrainians, okay? The Ukrainians also should think it's enough. I know the Poles never think it's enough, but they will just have to leave them out of it. But we want this to end. So we're having a meeting with the Russians next week. And that meeting is going to be not about Ukraine, but about the START treaties, the nuclear treaties, which is absolutely what we have to talk about right now. The Russians like to step into negotiations. And they want to be able to say that they are talking to the Americans, but it has nothing to do about Ukraine. We'll do it. But everything is in flux. Everything is changing. And I suspect this war cannot last another month. And I expect the Chinese and American relationship will be different. We'll be in a different world. Well, the Americans have their own interests. And sometimes it's forgetting, and sometimes not forgetting. One of the problems of Europe is it believes that we have a moral responsibility to care. And Ukraine has that feeling. Obviously, that was a terrible accident, that note leaking. No one wanted it to leak. But the message was relieved to the Ukrainians, which has been relieved by General Milan, who is the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's going on in many different ways. When we take a look at the most stable agreement, World War II, it consisted of the United States guaranteeing Germany, its enemy. And it worked because the United States really wanted to block the Russians from reaching the Atlantic. The Russians weren't about to risk anything that crazy. And as a result, the Americans had an interest in Germany that spread out to the rest of Europe. And that really was the foundation of the Cold War. So how do you guarantee that the Americans will cooperate? Well, look at the World War II model. We know what our dangers are, respect our fears, collaborate with us, and then you can count on us. In the case of the Ukrainians, they have this guarantee: we do not want the Russians at the borders of NATO. And if we double-cross the Ukrainians and the Russians come into the fight again, that's a real possibility. So understand the American fears and the American, what they are resolved to do, and you'll see that we are prepared to end the war, have all sorts of concessions to the Russians, except one. They can have maybe part of the eastern area, but they cannot threaten NATO. And if they understand that, then everybody can understand each other. My question still is, who is going to negotiate for the Russians? It is easier to stay in NATO than to leave it for political reasons and otherwise. But we always find the Europeans take positions. They don't deploy troops. When they deploy troops, it's not many. So in Europe at this point, in our fight with Ukraine, we have Ukraine as an supporter, Poland, the UK, Brits, always our partners.